So, welcome to EXP DEI's first ever unconscious bias training presentation. This was prepared lovingly by myself and my DEI coordinator, Janae Robbins. Today's agenda, we're going to define what bias is. We're going to talk about the 13 different types of bias. There's 13 of them. The causes and influences, the impact, the importance of understanding bias, and how we can reduce bias. So first, we're going to give some thoughts on diversity. We're going to set the stage for why it matters to address these biases. I love the little the diagram here of everybody looking at this symbol on the ground and coming up with a different idea. All of them valid, but it's a way of thought diversity is what I love, and this is something that I've always believed in. Is thought diversity, and here's the hiring proposition. When we have a team full of people who come from similar backgrounds, we're all approaching the problem in similar ways and can easily develop problem-solving blind spots. When we have a team full of people who come from different backgrounds, we can approach any problem from so many angles that we always find the best solution. So you and me coming from different places, thinking about things in different ways is the healthiest thing possible for a team. To give it a little a metaphor that I hear too often on thought diversity is thinking about it like the reason that we don't believe in inbreeding, right? If you have too much of the same in a bloodstream, it taints it. But like you see with dogs also, if you see a mixed breed dog, they are often hardier, healthier, and friendlier dogs. So we'll set the stage. Here's some basics on unconscious bias. Most people want to be fair and objective individuals, but to be biased is to be human. And while biases are part of how we process the world, we need to take proactive steps to work through them. So what we're saying here is that everybody has bias. That's a human thing to have. But it's also something that we as humans should be working every day to counteract. This training is an invitation to challenge ourselves and explore our own biases. We'll be presenting opportunities to reflect and actively work on disrupting our biases. It may feel uncomfortable, and that's okay because it's part of the journey. Some of this stuff is going to make you think, wow, do I do that? And maybe you do, but that's part of being human, and that's okay. As long as you can acknowledge it, that means you can work on it. When we meet someone for the first time, we make assumptions about them based on how they dress, how they look, or how they act. These reactions are indicators of unconscious bias, and they affect all of us every day. If you believe that you aren't a prejudiced person, or if you recognize that you do have some prejudiced views that you struggle with, this training is for you. So let's talk about what bias is. Biases are prejudices or bigoted viewpoints in favor of or discriminating against a thing, person, or group compared to interactions with others that are conducted fairly. So that's an important note that biases are both in the affirmative and in the negative. For instance, you could say that you have a positive bias towards African American women. Every time I've worked with an African American woman, it's been a positive experience. That's a positive bias, because then the opposite is happening where you think negatively about people that don't fall into that category. Biases are very much a real thing, and they do pose a significant threat to those impacted by them. And biases can be enacted by anyone, including and especially by institutional forces who regulate entities such as school and work. So unconscious biases often find their way into the controls around our workplaces and our schools. This is the difference, a good diagram about conscious bias versus unconscious bias. Conscious bias refers to biased attitudes that you are aware of. If someone comes out and says, I don't like illegal immigrants, right? That person has made a biased statement and they support that biased statement. Unconscious bias refers to biased attitudes that operate outside your awareness and control. So if you say that you support illegal immigrants, that you believe that they deserve rights and human rights and all that sort of thing. But then when you see someone who looks like they're foreign and they do something that you don't particularly care for, then your brain goes, oh, it's because they're an illegal immigrant. That's an unconscious bias. Conscious bias, we know we're being biased and we're doing it intentionally. Unconscious bias, we may not be aware that we hold biased attitudes towards certain things. That's the big one on unconscious bias for me. Is the point is you may not even know that you have a bigoted perspective and you don't recognize that your mind is working that way sometimes. In conscious bias, there can be malicious intent. In unconscious bias, there isn't malicious intent. Conscious bias is easy to observe, and unconscious bias takes a little closer look to recognize. Unconscious bias, when we dig deeper, this is a term that was coined by social psychologists. I'm not going to pretend to be able to pronounce that word. And Tony Greenwald in the 1990s, who published the implicit social cognitive theory, asserting that individual social behavior and biases are largely unconscious or implicit judgments. Everyone can and often does have their own form of these concerning various identities and social groups. They originate from societal expectations of categorizing and organizing ourselves within our world. It's important to know that while everyone has these biases, we still have to be aware of them and also actively work against them in order to behave in an equitable and inclusive manner. And that's something that has been lacking in many unconscious bias trainings, that has led to unfavorable results in measuring the success of the trainings. Is that often in these trainings we will see where it's said that unconscious biases are something that we all have and there's nothing we can do about it. And then people say, okay, there's nothing I can do about it, then I can switch off and don't have to really pay attention or follow through with anything after this training, right? What we're saying here is that once you discover that you have an unconscious bias, it's your job to constantly actively work against that bias until it changes. So let's test our knowledge now that we know what conscious versus unconscious bias is. I'm going to tell you this little story. Marcus applied for parental leave to care for his newborn child. Although he was entitled to his leave, his manager suggested that, as a father, he may choose not to take the full duration. Since his return to work, Marcus has not been invited to team events, and he was overlooked for a new project. He asked his manager for an explanation. They told Marcus that they did not want to introduce additional demands at work while he's adjusting to being a new parent. Do you think you saw conscious bias or unconscious bias in this scenario? Go ahead and answer in the chat. Yeah, yeah. Conscious, lots of people answering conscious. Now, third option here, do you think there was both there? Yep, yep. Now let's dig into this. So it is both. And when initially requesting parental leave, Marcus's manager demonstrated conscious bias by suggesting that a man may require less time with his family. Upon returning from leave, the manager demonstrated unconscious bias that a new parent may not be capable of balancing work and family needs. In this scenario, the manager's unconscious bias also impacted Marcus's career progression and future opportunities. Right. And that's true. Some of us would see that as conscious bias, that they actively hold the view that a new parent may not be capable of balancing work and family needs. But I think that if you asked most managers, do you think a new parent can manage their work and family needs? They would say, well, if their parental leave is over, then yes. But this person was saying that no, as a new parent, you know, I don't think that they can balance their work and family needs. So they're categorizing that here as an unconscious bias. All right, now we're going to go through very quickly the 13 types of biases. And these are really interesting in helping us understand um, that there's a big variety of biases we can have. So, type number one is appearance biases. That's a snap judgment made based on physical appearance, which comes in three categories: beauty, weight, and height. Examples include something called pretty privilege, which is a form of privilege that allows attractive women to be treated with human decency and respect, and other women to be demeaned and mistreated. Right? And again, we're also talking about beauty being in the eye of the beholder, right? So it's about what the other person, the viewer, thinks of this woman, and not necessarily a given physical trait. Bullying and harassment of plus size individuals on social media and in other media for displaying confidence in their sizes and shapes. In severe cases, fat phobia has led to harmful actions against targeted individuals. We have seen in the news in the past couple of years where a plus size model has flaunted her body on Instagram, and there's a large portion of the country that would say, you go. That's empowerment at its best. And then there's also a portion of society that would attack this person, and in one recent case in the news, actually physically attacked someone uh, because they were displaying confidence in their own beauty. And then we also have avoidance of interactions with shorter men due to negative stereotypes associated with their height. There's uh, quite a few people, men and women, who would not date a man if they're under a certain height, right? We see that on dating platforms. No one under, whatever, 5'10", something like that. Those are all appearance biases. And like I said, these can come down to positive biases and negative biases. And with either, the opposite force is also just as powerful. So if you have a preference for a certain physical trait in someone that you find beautiful, you could have an unconscious bias to treat them better in the world. Whereas someone who has maybe the opposite of that trait, you would treat worse. So that's important to recognize in ourselves and make sure that we're treating everyone, regardless of their appearance, with the same dignity and respect. The second is affinity bias. Affinity bias is the inclination to favor or choose people who we identify as similar to us. We find comfort and belonging in this action, but we simultaneously are shutting out those who are different. An example would be a manager who hires an applicant because they're alumni of the same university. Right. This is one that I catch myself in a lot. If I see myself in someone, how often do you hear that from a manager? I hired this person because I see myself in them. That's a bias. That's affinity bias. Um, and it's one that I struggle with myself. I tend to surround myself with people who remind me of me. Not always great. All right, type 3, confirmation bias. This is one that's big in society today. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out and interpret new information in a way that confirms what we already believed to be true. Example would be voters who ignore information from news broadcasters when it contradicts their existing views, leading to a divisive split of those who watch, for instance, CNN versus Fox News. So when you're taking in new information, if it lines up with what you believe, then you're more likely to accept it. Somebody tells you that something is wrong with someone that you wholeheartedly believed in, that they did something that's unconscionable. We're more likely to forgive that person because they agree with us. Then we have attrition bias. This one's a little more complicated. This is correlating people's actions with characteristics that may be unrelated or untrue. This bias causes us to make inferences about the causes of events or behaviors without necessarily considering all of the facts. Good example of this one is assuming a coworker who is repeatedly late to work is lazy or possesses a poor work ethic. In reality, they could rely on unfortunately unreliable public transportation or have children that they have to drop off at school and don't have additional assistance. So this is when you make an assumption about someone that then causes a bias. That's attrition bias. So now we're going to pause and get an assumption piece here. You don't have to type in this one. I just want you to think in your head. What feelings or assumptions you have about this person who's pictured? Just write out the gut. Classy, yeah. That personally, my first thought was someone who values her culture. Right. Now, would you have guessed that she's a business executive, a local council representative, and is leading education reforms in her community? Just right off the bat, all those things you were thinking about this person, would you have guessed that she's an executive level member of her company? Often the answer would be no. I mean, many of us would like to say that that wouldn't have surprised us. But if you passed this person on the street, would your first thought have been, I bet she's a CEO? Right. Those are unconscious biases. All right, moving on to type 5, which is gender bias. This one is very prevalent, and we all know it. Gender bias is unintentional associations based on a person's gender, often stemming from traditions, values, social norms, or culture. Example here is a woman being hired for a leadership position that she's well qualified and educated for, yet receiving lower pay than other leaders who may or may not possess the same qualities or have further education. Because she has to, quote unquote, build rank within the company that a male counterpart may not have to. In most of these cases, the pay never equitably increases or matches that of her peers, which is why the gender pay gap exists. So gender bias is one where we have a very, very clear-cut, measurable proof that this is something that business culture in general has, right? It's everywhere. This one's insidious because it exists, it's real, it's always existed. And we have to do more than just fight our own perceptions of this. We have to be allies and advocates and push for everybody to believe that this isn't right. It's the only way to change a society is for all of us to speak up. Type 6 is color and culture bias. This is bias against someone based on their race, ethnicity, or culture. This one is also highly real, also really impacts people. We also have a major pay gap here with race and ethnicity. An example there would be deeming traditional wear, artifacts, or styles of tribal groups or religious groups as unprofessional. Then we've got age bias. This is judgments about individuals based solely on their age. Another one that we see big time. Examples is believing that young professionals lack experience or the ability to make a wise decision, or that older professionals are outdated or behind the times. So both of those views are not right. We often see that a young executive is seen as power hungry or going to be quick to burn out or maybe is a kid genius, that sort of thing. All those are unconscious biases because they're assumptions being made about someone. Name bias. This one exists, and we don't like to admit it, but many of us do this. Tendency to judge and prefer people with names that your brain perceives to be appropriate. An example will be resumes with ethnic names, traditionally those associated with Black, Latin, and Asian cultures, receiving less attention from recruiters and hiring managers. Me personally, I have seen this really manifest itself with my African American friends. In many cases, if they have a name that is even remotely unfamiliar to a white speaker, then they'll be passed on. Or when judging equal resumes next to each other, you'll always see them tend more towards the name that's familiar with them. We also frequently see this as poking fun at someone for their name, right? See someone has a moderately funny name, and so we make a little joke about it. That's a bias. All right, next, feelings and assumptions. What do we feel or assume about this guy? And you can feel free to keep that private or put it in the chat if you'd like. Has a good barber. Yeah, that's a pretty clean mohawk, isn't it? I love a distressed bomber jacket. That makes me think either this guy, you know, has seen some things in that jacket, or it was very expensive. I agree, Lori. I think he looks cool. All right. So, would you have guessed that he's a doctor, a father, and a mentor to LGBTQ plus medical students at the university he attended? Um, I can tell you, no, I didn't think any of those things about him. That's that's just the way your brain works. Okay, authority bias is our next one, type 9. The tendency to place more weight on the opinion or idea of an authority figure, which can lead to people treating those authority figures more favorably. We have an example here that someone losing a major chunk of their stock due to strictly following the advice of someone they consider an authority on the subject. I'm going to take this one a step farther with authority bias. Say we're having a team meeting, and a new team member comes up with an idea, and the manager says, "I've got a better idea. How about this?" Now, regardless of whether the manager's idea was better or not, how many of us would assume that their opinion carried more weight? Right? That's authority bias. You have to take everybody's opinions at face value. I do recognize that there is a level of experience there that the manager may have that the new employee doesn't. But often discounting someone's opinion because they're new will lead us to not finding the innovations that we need to move our business forward. Stagnation. That's exactly the word I was looking for. Thank you, Hannah. Welcome to my brain. Type 10 is conformity bias. This is the swaying or influencing of views by another's point of view. In turn, our tendency to take cues for proper behavior in most contexts derives from the actions and opinions of others rather than our own individualistic or independent thought. We've got examples here, but I'm going to tell you one. So for me, there are times when we're looking for movies to watch on Netflix, and we'll pass a movie and we'll say, oh, I saw that, but I hated that. But then I think about it and I'm like, wait, I think we watched that and my husband hated it. And I'm and I'm just agreeing, right? Um, some examples that we have here is a member of an interview panel settles on the candidate that the rest of the panel views as more favorable, despite feeling strongly about another candidate. We got three people on the interview panel. Two of them are saying, I really believe in this one person. You feel strongly about the third. But you go with them. Um, and the the thought there is that you're not just going with them because they're the majority or just going with them because you necessarily agree with their points, but after hearing their points, you may just feel the need to fit in, right? That happens to us. Or a person chooses not to involve themselves in politics and instead votes the way their parents or their family do without researching for themselves what they're voting. Um, I would assume that because I like my mom, that I could, I'd be safe to vote like she does. That would be an incorrect assumption in my case. Then we have experience bias. Now, this is different than the bias that we had earlier. This is one that's a little trickier, but it's the belief that everyone thinks or understands the way that we do, and anyone who disagrees is wrong, right? We see that a lot in 2022, don't we? An example here is during a pitch to a potential client, the salesperson assumed that the client had the same product knowledge as she did. This resulted in her not providing enough context in the pitch and losing their business. I think we also have a lot of this in political circles where you hear that something confirms a bias that you have on the news, and then you assume that everybody thinks that way, right? Because it was on the news. Then we have attribution bias. This is one that happens all the time. When we perceive or judge the actions of others more harshly than we would judge ourselves. An example, you see a coworker is always late coming back from their lunch break and assume that they are not as committed to their job as you are. You then notice you're actually a few minutes late as well, but you think to yourself that it's okay because you worked hard today, right? Uh, I'm not going to tell you to raise your hands, but I would raise my hand on this one. I've done this. Um, it's something that you have to catch, and something you have to work on. I'm going to talk about my personal unconscious bias experience. I, in my previous life as a banker, was told often that I was too extra or too loud or too disruptive or too distracted or too difficult or too involved, right? Um, it would not be the first time it was said about me if someone said that I was a diva. um, and then often what this leads to is when I go out for a job, um, I would hear things like, "You're the best candidate we've seen by a long shot. We don't have any feedback, but we went with somebody else," right? It's something about me, something in my interview. Am I too confident? Do they think that me being involved with affinity groups or employee resource groups is distracting from the job? Do they think that my views on my team as a manager are too close to business, too involved? Um, all of those are biases against me that don't take into account that I'm a whole person and that people can grow and people can change. That you can teach an old dog new tricks, right? Um, it's something that I I bring all this up um, because something that we often don't do when we're talking about unconscious bias, we're often thinking about how do I have unconscious biases against others. But I really want everybody to take this opportunity to think, how have I experienced unconscious bias discrimination? Have I ever felt like someone wrongly judged me because of something out of my control? Right? Do we think maybe that person didn't even know that they were doing that? For me, when I had to turn the lens back around on myself and say, have I ever been discriminated against with unconscious bias? More than just, somebody being like, hey, saying something about me being gay. That's someone that had a conscious bias, right? That's someone that doesn't like gay people and says something about me. But the unconscious bias is it's a little trickier to notice if someone is experiencing unconscious bias against you. So I'd like you to take that as a takeaway from this training and really think about how that makes you feel and what you would do to address it the next time. All right, and now we're up to the 13th and final type of bias. And this one is, really, really, it happens a lot. Expedience bias. When we make a decision based on what comes to mind fastest, rather than being deliberate and gathering objective information. Some people say this is being hasty. It actually is a bias. An example, you're working on a tight deadline, you move forward with a decision without exploring additional perspectives and solutions that might better fit the requirements. That's, I was just trying to get to the answer as quick as I could. That's a bias. And then beyond the 13 types of bias, we have two influencing effects that you should know about: halo and the horn effect. The halo effect is the tendency to use an overall positive impression of a person to influence other judgments of their character. Example, I love this artist's music, so I'll let some of their indiscretions slide. Right? In contrast, the horn effect is the kind of effect as a snap judgment made about someone's character on the basis of one perceived negative trait. Example, speaking to a customer service representative and they mispronounce a word. So you view them as unintelligent for the remainder of the interaction. I know this happens to me often. I have a pet peeve for the mispronunciation of a particular word. And sometimes I'll be speaking to someone who I respect ad infinitum, and then they will they will use this word, and my brain immediately goes, "Shut it down. This person isn't as smart as you thought they were." Walk out of the room, tell them, tell them what you think. But what I have to do in that situation is realize this is cultural. This is something that not everybody learned to pronounce words the way you did. It has nothing to do with their intelligence. It has nothing at all to do with their ability to carry on a conversation or be your friend or be your coworker. It's just something that they heard differently in their life experience. I'd rather not. I'd rather not share the word. Okay. Uh, Causes and influences. So, some causes for unconscious bias. Cause number one, this is the primary factor in unconscious bias, is our natural tendency to seek patterns. Often our brains naturally search for familiar associations in the world. That's social cognition, which is our ability to store, process, and apply information, is dependent on the ability to form associations about the world. So it's reasonable for the tendency to um, in that way, if we see a particular type of person characterized a particular type of way in, say, the media or the news or in people that we've been exposed to in our life, then we now have that ingrained in our body to believe that that stereotype is true. And whether or not we agree with it, often when push comes to shove, when you're in a highly stressful situation, your brain's first thing it's going to do is jump to that negative association from the things in your world before you can take a second to react and really process that. No, wait, I don't really think that. It still exists in your mind because you consumed that media, or you saw that person, or this is stuff that happens in the world, forms our brains natural associations. It puts people into categories. If a category has a tendency to any trait, then your brain goes there first, and it's your job to figure out what happens next. Cause number 2 is a forte for shortcuts. Similar to other cognitive biases, unconscious biases are the result of the brain's inclination to simplify the world. With the inundating process of retaining information, our brains seek mental shortcuts to expedite and simplify the assortment of data we store. So something that I saw in a training that really got me going is target training. Starts with this question. Did everybody in the audience know that Judge Judy from TV is married to an African American man? Now, I don't want you to answer, but I want you to catalog the mental gymnastics that your brain just did when they took that. Now, the truth is that's not true. But what did your brain do when I told you that information? Did it go back and make you think about episodes of Judge Judy to see how that changes your view on the way she thinks? Did you go, oh, I didn't know that about her. Let me try really quickly to let my brain line up so that she fits in with the type of white women who marry African American men, right? Your brain did a whole bunch of little flips just then, probably, to make her associate with a different ideal of her than you originally had. Those are your unconscious biases living in the back of your brain coming to the front. Now we're going to talk about influences. Influence number 1 is generalizations and stereotypes. Everyone engages in them. It's not a direct indication of prejudice or discriminatory recurring behavior. Generally, it's difficult to separate from the influence of society with environmental influences and pre-existing stereotypes. Additional factors such as stress, time pressure, and multitasking aid in perpetuating these biases. So just like we were talking about before, this is generalizations and stereotypes based on our experiences, and more as we're more inundated with media and TV and books and the portrayal of people, which is separate than the reality of people, leading to generalizations and stereotypes. Influence 2 is social conditioning, behaviors, and life experiences. These biases are commonly influenced by experiences, although they may have no correlation. That is to say that I think about a certain type of person in a certain type of way because someone like that did something to me before in my life. But those people don't have anything to do with that person who did that to you, right? Social conditioning, including media portrayals and cultural upbringing, may factor into biases regarding members of other social groups. I know up until recently, when LGBTQ folks were more visible in people's lives because of the wave of young people coming out of the closet, I can remember a time in my life when no one I knew had ever met another gay person. And their only point of reference for gay people was Elton John, Ellen DeGeneres, and maybe Liberace, right? So not real, all that we know about those people is what the media has shown us of those people. As a result of our conditioning, these biases may transform into expectations or assumptions, which are dictated by stereotypes on social identities and group associations. Now, a question. This is for anyone who's ever conducted an interview. Which of the following is a biased way of conducting an interview? A, looking for someone who's different from your team members. B, looking for a good cultural fit. C, asking questions about the candidate's personal life experiences. Or D, asking questions about the candidate's prior work experience. Which one of those is biased? Got a guess for B? Yeah, got a guess for B. Got a guess for C. Got another. Okay. B for C. About D. Got one for A. Okay. So the answer here, it may be not what you were expecting, but the answer is, if I can go back, the answer is B. Looking for a good cultural fit. Looking for a good cultural fit implies that you're looking for someone who is similar to your team. It's a bias, right? Looking for someone who's different from your existing team members that's a good way to think about someone equitably. Asking questions about a candidate's personal life experiences, that just lets you get to know someone better. There could be bias there, but that depends on the person. Asking questions about the candidate's prior work experience is just a general view. Cultural fit for your team is about attitude. That's a good point. That's a good point. But then I would say that we're taking a different definition of cultural there. Our culture is diversity. That's right. That's right. That's a good counterpoint there, Hannah. That's true. All right, now we're going to talk about the impact of unconscious bias. Impact number one is the perpetuation of biases. So what does perpetuation of biases lead to? Bullying, harassment, discrimination, feelings of unbelonging, and with this, often marginalized. Oh, my tongue did not agree with that word. And with this, often marginalized and vulnerable employees experienced a heightened sense of anxiety, right? So when you feel like you don't belong on a team, it stresses you out. That's a very human thing, which leads to decreased productivity, disengagement, impaired diversity, and very importantly, lower staff retention rates, right? You want your staff to stay, then you make them feel like they belong, right? And belonging does not mean the people in the team are like me. It's, I am valued. That's more important. Oh, that was a click of the mouse too far to the right. Hey-o. Welcome to EXP World. Impact number two, institutional practices and structures. How can they be influenced by these biases? So it can also lead to an exclusive workplace culture. It increases the reliance on traditional hiring methods, such as resumes and unstructured interviews, and biases related to appearance, name, and language are particularly prevalent in the hiring methods and interview methods. Impact number three is image and mass media. We're going to talk about the role of mass media in bias circulation. For Repeated exposure to images and themes may affect a person's beliefs and behaviors, and this is used as a tool to sway people's behavior one way or another, i.e., influencing political views, reinforcing stereotypes, or giving fictional portrayals of real-life issues and situations. Now, you may think this is artistic license that people are using. I can tell you that when the media portrays someone in a light, they are portraying them in that light for the purpose of making you see in that light. So you have to think for yourself. Also, with fictional portrayals of types of people, or most insidious to me is portrayals in the media of people with mental illness. You have to realize that these are fictional, right? Something that we often see, and I brought this up in a session we've done before, but think of the times on a television show where you've seen someone with bipolar disorder. How were they characterized in that show? Often as someone who is a loose cannon, often as someone who cannot cope with life without their meds, often as someone who is, one of my least favorite words, crazy, right? And those aren't real. So allowing those perspectives of someone to seep into your life, affect your view of someone. What would happen if you saw a portrayal like that and then your child was diagnosed with bipolar disorder? What would you have to overcome in your mind just to get past that unconscious bias before you can start doing the work to help your child feel better, right? We also say here that it may damage self-image. This is particularly prevalent for young girls. Research by psychologists has shown that adolescent boys have greater agency over their bodies, their conceptualization of them, and use more active coping skills for their bodily image than girls in comparisons of themselves to those they see represented in the media. I used to have a foster daughter named Nellie who had a very particular ideal of beauty as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed princess in a long dress. And when she would see someone who didn't meet those goals, one word came out of her mouth every time: ugly, right? That means not only people of different hair and eye colors, but anyone of a different race, right? These are biases that were born into her by the previous parents that she had. And the worst thing about those biases, she was a brunette with brown eyes. So what's growing up going to be like for her unless we help her tackle that bias? Then we have stereotype threat. Areas in which the threat may materialize are school and work. So in school, we see young girls in school often internalize general gender biases and those related to STEM performance. Research shows that girls as young as 9 display unconscious beliefs on women's preferences for arts and humanities over STEM. In fact, women are less likely to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, other STEM-related fields. And educators may interact with female students differently if they partake in or enable these biases. And then also at work, hiring managers receiving similar resumes from job applicants, yet select one group of applicants over another in spite of them both having equal qualifications for a role. In that situation, those hiring managers really need to look at their unconscious bias for why they made that snap decision for one group over another. Looking at the stereotype threat here, these are the top 5 professions boys and girls want to be when they grow up. For boys, it's pro athlete, I don't know, firefighter, engineer, and astronaut. For girls, overwhelmingly, it's doctor, teacher, don't know, scientist, and chef maker. So we see where that impacts all of us. Additional settings. Healthcare and legal settings. This plays a role in patient treatment by medical practitioners, reception of quality health, and long-term effects, including suboptimal care, adverse outcomes, and death. If someone isn't being culturally heard by their doctor or their mental health practitioner, then they may be receiving poor health care. They may be being misdiagnosed. They could die. It is that serious. For legal settings, troubling implications arise in legal proceedings, in hostile police contact based on unconscious biases, in racial disparities in sentencing. We see in America particularly that marginalized populations face longer and harsher sentences. And there's nothing we can point to for the reasoning behind that other than unconscious bias. Real estate. Over-reliance on credit scores for home buyers who are LGBT+ and or people of color. Predatory lending by institutions that disparage home buyers who are LGBTQ+ and or people of color. And denial of a group of applicants due to their current neighborhood being valued at lower rates or historically occupied by communities of color. This resulted in $156 billion in cumulative losses for Black families and exacerbated the wealth gap between white and Black homeowners due to being judged on the neighborhood's low value where they're coming from. And we also, in real estate, we also talk about the presence of gentrification. Biases may be embodied by selling properties in lower income areas. This brings an influence of the affluent and privileged, converts properties into expensive housing, and usually leads to forced displacement, abuse of power, and the exclusion of poor, racially marginalized, queer, and other vulnerable communities. We also see this happen in what you may have heard us refer to as environmental racism, where communities of color are pushed into neighborhoods where the soil or the air may not be livable, right? We see those people pushed into communities near old industrial districts. The positive impacts of unconscious bias training. We're going to talk about some of the data that's been reported. A 2-year study with the University of Wisconsin STEM faculty showed hiring of women increased from 32 to 47% after they put unconscious bias training as mandatory. Participants reported being more comfortable at work and feeling more validated at work. And those who hadn't participated reported that hiring of women remained flat, no change. Here's an example of bias. Criminal records and hiring. Does a criminal record, regardless of crime or rehabilitation, hinder a job hunt? Studies conducted over the course of a year with a sample of white and Black 23-year-old students with and without made-up criminal records. They applied for 350 jobs in Milwaukee. Evidence of hiring discrimination shows that 17% of the white students were still hired, and 5% of the Black students were hired with a criminal record. For those without records, it was 34% of the white students got hired and 14% of the Black students got hired. And then, despite showing a clear preference to the white students, a follow-up survey was done with the managers who indicated that they had no preference, right? Because nobody's gonna say, I have a bias, a racial bias, but it could be unconscious. It could be that those people didn't know that they were favoring the white over the Black, right? Those are unconscious biases here. And this is what the impact looks like. Now, here's an example of successful unconscious bias training. This is Starbucks and the call heard around the world. On April 12, 2018, 2 young African-American entrepreneurs, Dante Robinson and Rayshawn Nelson, had been waiting at a Philadelphia Starbucks for a business meeting to begin when a manager called the police on them after they didn't order anything. The 2 were arrested and led out in handcuffs. It had been less than 10 minutes since they arrived. A video of the incident went viral, the latest example of people of color being arrested, or worse, for simply being in a public space in America. And what happened next at Starbucks is what sets them apart. In response, Starbucks closed all 8,000 of its stores to facilitate unconscious bias training for a full day. They holistically looked at all of their policies to review inherent bias in them. They focused on building an inclusive culture that reflected their brand. They made trainings short but mandatory and revisited them every 7 weeks. They built their trainings to prompt curiosity and focused on building empathy. Now, the real impact of this is, if you'll remember, I'll say that we started having mandatory unconscious bias trainings as a standard in the market in 2018. What do you think prompted that? This. Starbucks saw success in this, and everybody followed suit. But we have to do more than just say we offer the same kind of training that Starbucks did in response to the call heard around the world. We have to say we have unconscious bias training and we're pushing the envelope farther than anybody else has. Now, how many companies give their employees strategies for reducing bias? What do you think? We're not talking about giving them unconscious bias training. We're talking about actually giving you strategies to address them. Six, 10. So I don't have the answer there, but the answer is 10%. 10%. Right? So that's where we have to step up and actually give you some strategies. So we've also got some pitfalls here in corporate diversity. Can experiences with workplace bias hinder your corporate success? The short answer is yes. Prospective employees of color utilize job review platforms such as Dipper and Glassdoor to conduct research on companies. Disparaging remarks and reviews about workplace DEI efforts repel employees of color the most, especially those from Black and Latinx populations. Comments on the company's employees, associates, and affiliates are also taken into account, and if any perpetuate social offenses, they may also turn these demographics away. According to a 2021 census report, hiring managers indicate a preference for job seekers ages 18 to 34, all of which are part of the socially progressive generations of millennials and Gen Z. Individuals in this demographic are more likely to seek inclusivity, acceptance, and diversity in job searches, and they're more critical of companies who may appear to be pandering in their DEI strategy. This doesn't, however, have to be a never-ending cycle. Companies can, through bold action and proper amends, use controversy as an opportunity to grow and adapt. However, sincerity and follow-through are vital. So here we see the cycle. Company has a controversy, which leads to bad reviews, which leads to a low percent of people of color applicants, which leads to a lack of diversity because those people aren't applying. The lack of diversity leads to a controversy because your company is not diverse, which leads to bad reviews, which leads to a low percentage of applicants, right? And around it goes. But bold action and proper amends, company can break the cycle. Now the importance. Refusal to address these biases causes real harm. Institutional discrimination results in unfair hiring decisions, unfair performance evaluations, unfair promotions, unfair work division, and may bring with it workplace attrition, mediation, and labor disputes. So that's a really easy way to say this hurts people and it hurts your business. And removing the biases, positive and equitable outcomes can and will ensue. Social awareness may be brought, as well as understanding of structural oppression, denial of the past tools of oppression. Individual action alone is static. Sharing this knowledge is active. So, doing denial of the past tools of oppression. Individual action alone is static. Sharing this knowledge is active. So, doing it by yourself isn't enough. It's great. We're encouraging all of you to take action to fight your unconscious biases. but you also have to share your knowledge of how you fought those biases. Tell people, I used to think this way, and then this happened and changed it. It also leads to equitable hiring practices, promotions, awards, and recognition increase. Empathy towards our fellow human beings grows, leading to a more compassionate society. Isn't that a beautiful sentence? A more compassionate society. Question. To create effective change in eliminating unconscious biases, what steps should we take? Challenging the biases we hear or partake in, spreading knowledge on how to reduce the biases, holding our systemic functions accountable, or all of the above. This is an easy one. It's a no-brainer. You sat through this course. What is it? It's D. For those in the back, it's D. It's all of the above. Some ways to reduce biases. Strive to diversify your work teams, departments, and groups, and recognize and teach intersectionality. Maintain diverse culture and interactions. Use neutral language and welcoming critiques and challenges to decisions without chastisement. That's so important. Welcome critiques. Even if you're a manager, welcome those critiques. Encourage attendance of DEI events, which are built to encourage growth of personal empathy. Utilize the DEI workplace group or DEI at exprealty.net to vent and discuss ideas you encounter in a safe space. Ensure awards, recognition, and promotions are given equitably. Include and welcome different people into our work comfort zone. Right? Don't surround yourself with people that'll like you or that you get along with. Surround yourself with people who challenge you. Surround yourself with people who come from a different life experience. The way that your experience in life will grow and the value of your life will be so much greater if you surround yourself with people who make you better. That's the end of our course. I know we went a little over time. I hope you guys all took something from this, and we'll very shortly be putting out a feedback Google form, and I would encourage you all to really think about this stuff. Thank you very much for attending. Our next event is going to be coming up. We're pushing for the date of Tuesday, August 2nd, and we're still working out who is going to be presenting with us. But while I'm out on vacation, you guys are going to enjoy seeing Miss Janae Robbins lead her first event for DEI, and she's going to be leading a event not August 2nd, August 16th. Thank you, Lori. My brain is in a fog. On August 16th, Miss Janae Robbins is going to be leading her first event on behalf of DEI, and it's going to be Women at Work. It's going to be a discussion about the pay gap and gender inequality in the workplace, and it's going to be a fireside chat with some great folks, and it's in honor of Single Working Women's Day, and what's the other one, Janae? Shout out to me.
It's a National Black Women's Equal Day.
That's it. National Black Women's Equal Pay Day. It's a lot of words, but it's an important topic. And yeah, so join us. That one's going to be a fireside chat around our lovely fireside. There, you can navigate there by clicking Go To, and then it's campus locations, and then fireside, right? Or campsite, world campsite, something like that. That's where that will be held, likely in this time slot, 2 Tuesdays from now. We hope you'll attend, and thank you very much.